So I wanted to do a short response video to the so-called rebuttal of my last video by John Salza. In general, I gotta say I'm pretty disappointed by his treatment of my arguments as well as me as a person, both in tone and in substance. And let me just say right at the beginning, Mr. Salza, as I thought, still didn't address the fact that he truly misquoted Archbishop Lefebvre. We gave him a chance to clarify why he did this, but he didn't take it. So we can now say with confidence that he obviously doesn't care about the truth here. Another thing I want to mention at the start is that I really have doubts if Mr. Salza watched my video, at least if he watched it with any kind of care. Because at one point in our short discussion in the comment section below the video, he seriously asked me if I concede that Lefebvre said that, quote, "This bishop has no other basis for jurisdiction than that of the request of the faithful to save their souls," end quote. He asked me this seriously when this was the exact quote I cited in my video when I corrected Mr. Salza's misquotation. So yes, Lefebvre wrote that in his letter, and there's nothing to concede here on my part. I literally quoted this exact sentence in my video. If Mr. Salza really watched my video, he should have known that, because this was within the first 10 minutes or so. Also, I will be skipping the cheap ad hominems that Mr. Salza engaged in his rebuttal, and I will focus on his critique, which tries to be substantial. Let's start with the topic of jurisdiction. In his rebuttal, Mr. Salza says that he never stated that Lefebvre thought that jurisdiction only comes from the people. And obviously, this is not what he himself believes. Here he referred to a talk where he even said that, quote, "Lefebvre knew that jurisdiction comes from the Pope," and so on, end quote. Saying that this shows that he didn't believe that Lefebvre believed that jurisdiction comes only from the people. There are a few things to unpack here. First of all, I never used the word only actually. I rather said that Mr. Salza's claim is that Lefebvre believed that in general, jurisdiction as such comes from the people. These are the words and terms I used in my video. Additionally, his quotes in the video I addressed give a very exclusive impression, leading the average listener to believe that this is also the only valid principle for Lefebvre in John Salza's mind. Here are 3 statements from Mr. Salza he made in the video titled "The Errors of Archbishop Lefebvre" to substantiate my claim here. Quote, "The patron of the SSPX says that Archbishop Lefebvre's position that jurisdiction comes from the people is a heresy." Second quote, quote, "There is no other basis for jurisdiction in Lefebvre's mind other than that from the request of the faithful," end quote. Third and last quote, "I would like just one priest of the society come out and say, you know what, Archbishop Lefebvre was wrong by holding that jurisdiction comes from the people. Call it an error, call it a heresy, acknowledge what St. Pius X said about it, but please, would at least one society priest come out and say, you know what, Archbishop Lefebvre was wrong to hold that jurisdiction comes from the people, and admit that Lefebvre was wrong on his heresy, that jurisdiction comes from the people," end quote. Is it just me, or do these statements not leave a very exclusive impression? So to say that I was going too far with my assertion that Mr. Salza claims that Lefebvre believed that jurisdiction as such comes from the people is really unfounded. My questions here to Mr. Salza would be, what was Lefebvre's exact theory on jurisdiction? How many sources of jurisdiction existed in this theory? And on what theology did he base it on? I would be interested in any texts Salza wrote on that issue, because to simply claim that Lefebvre was confused or a hypocrite is just cheap and intellectually lazy. But interestingly enough, actually, all these points made by Mr. Salza in his rebuttal are besides the point. Upon further reflection, I came to the realization where Mr. Salza's confusion lies. In his rebuttal, Salza claims that my argument that Lefebvre was arguing for supplied jurisdiction doesn't work because, for the consecration of a bishop, there is no jurisdiction needed, but allowance from the Pope, making my argument nonsensical or misplaced in that regard. But there is a confusion on Salza's part here. In his letter, Lefebvre is not talking about the consecration itself for the future bishop. He's talking about the jurisdiction this bishop may then have after being consecrated a bishop, making my argument that Lefebvre was contemplating a possibility of supplied jurisdiction valid again, and the most plausible interpretation of the letter, because he's not thinking about jurisdiction for the consecration itself, but a jurisdiction which the bishop may be able to exercise as a bishop. Of course, Mr. Salza will say that that is heretical, to think that one is justified in consecrating a bishop against the explicit will of the Holy Father out of a state of necessity. But this is another question. In this letter, Lefebvre is not contemplating about the consecratal act itself, but rather about the jurisdiction the bishop will have after the consecration. Salza is confusing these two issues. So that makes my argument that Lefebvre was arguing for supplied jurisdiction sound again, and Salza's assertion that Lefebvre believes in the heresy that jurisdiction comes from the people, wrong. Because the most plausible reading of the letter is that Lefebvre argues for supplied jurisdiction for the bishop. Additionally, if this letter is Mr. Salza's main source to prove his point about Lefebvre being a heretic in that regard, I would advise Mr. Salza to seriously reconsider his position on this point, because wrongly accusing someone of heresy is a sin. But why does Mr. Salza interpret this letter in such a way? I think it is because Mr. Salza has a completely different premise than I and many others have. He thinks, or is actually 100% convinced, that Lefebvre believes that jurisdiction comes from the people. I think that Lefebvre didn't hold this heretical position. So I will see his statements in the letter in the light of supplied jurisdiction or ecclesia supplet. Now Salza, on the other hand, will interpret every statement by Lefebvre about jurisdiction in reference to people in such a way so that it supports his assertion. So he interprets Lefebvre's letter with the presupposition that Lefebvre is a heretic, and thus comes to the conclusion he already had. Now let's go on to the second topic that he addressed in his rebuttal, namely collegiality. At this point, his critique really goes off the rails, and he completely misunderstands and or misrepresents my presentation of the issue. The silliest accusation, though, by Mr. Salza is his claim that he isn't sure if I did any independent research and that I only use SSPX talking points, when this is the exact thing I did avoid intentionally. If he watched my video carefully, he would have seen that I mainly used Roberto de Mattei and his book The Second Vatican Council as a source, and also documents from Vatican II itself, where the SSPX did not exist yet, like the Note to the Holy Father by Cardinal Larraona, which Salza didn't address at all. It seems to be the case that Salza wants to totally diminish my credibility by creating the image that I either only use classical SSPX sources and talking points, or that I just make up my own stuff. This is evidently not the case, and it escapes me how one can make this accusation after really having watched my video carefully. First of all, I didn't even say that Lumen Gentium is novel as a general document, which Mr. Salza accuses me of. I only said that, quote, some would say that collegiality is a novel concept, end quote, which I then substantiate by quoting de Mattei, who said, quote, Vatican II did not explicitly reject the traditional concept of power, potestas. They set it aside, replacing it with an equivocal new concept, that of munus, end quote. So actually Mr. Salza has to attack de Mattei here, and not only me. Mr. Salza never even mentions de Mattei once, and during our short correspondence in the comments, he says that he didn't mention de Mattei because de Mattei embraced the errors of the SSPX. Really, it doesn't get any more ridiculous than that. Apparently everyone who disagrees with Mr. Salza is an SSPX source and or has embraced the errors of the SSPX. But actually again, all these things are relatively unimportant in regards to my main point, which Salza didn't even touch upon in any sort of way. I was making the case against the assertion of Mr. Salza that Lefebvre was essentially a pseudo-traditionalist who was basically alone in his resistance against certain novelties at the Second Vatican Council. And in my video, I proved that this is not the case. Salza doesn't even engage with this argument at any point in his rebuttal. And of course, because if he did, his whole argument would just fall apart, which is, again, to artificially isolate Lefebvre and then condemn his positions as being actually untraditional, which is an assertion we now hear often from various apologists, who seem to make it their ultimate goal to discredit the Archbishop or the traditional movement in general. All these arguments that Trades in general actually have a quasi-Protestant ecclesiology are pretty ridiculous, and I will go into this particular assertion in future videos. So all in all, I was really disappointed with this so-called rebuttal by Mr. Salza. I'm pretty sure that he won't be answering anymore to my next 2 videos, which are dedicated to correct and debunk Salza's unhinged anti-SSBX and anti-Lefebvre assertions. So I will continue my series. The video about Sunday obligation according to the PCED will be released soon. I can already say that I will be able to pretty decisively take apart Salza's assertion that on the one hand, the PCED was totally consistent regarding that question, and on the other hand, that it is actually much more plausible to come to the conclusion that you can fulfill your Sunday obligation according to the letters and documents put out by the PCED. In the end, I gotta say that Mr. Salza really lost much of his credibility in my eyes, and now I feel more confident that his positions are really extreme and ultimately untenable. Thank you for listening, and remember to always try to read everything from the beginning to the end. Jesus is King.